reviewing the meeting minutes. Thank you to our Stantec team for writing up our meeting summary minutes. Does any of the committee members have any questions or comments on the minutes?
I do.
Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Let me pull it up again. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Okay. And I'm only on page 3, but I'm sorry, let me find it. It's a section about the the open spots. Okay, so it's page, I think that's still page 3. It's item number 4, the charter and meetings. Okay. So the paragraph, these open seats will be filled if someone expresses an interest in serving on the GSPAC. The only parameters is that the individual is local to Big Valley Basin and that she or he has working knowledge of groundwater issues and water resources within Lake County. Now, I understand the second item, but I really don't recall discussing that they have to be local to the Big Valley Basin. I really don't recall discussing that, but you know, please correct me if I'm wrong, but.
Yeah, and Sarah, I think by local, it means to have local interest in, or to be, you know, to be affiliated in somewhere, to have knowledge of it. That was the parameter there. And I can pull up the charter and look at the actual language that we used in the charter for that. But I know that in our public meeting presentations that we've had and some of the others that we talked about, those were just kind of the 2 hallmarks of what we were looking for when we first started identifying potential stakeholders.
Right. So I think the language of local interest and local are really, there's a big distinction between the two. So I just recall in previous conversations that they had to be, you know, had to have knowledge of the basin and to have been involved in some way. But to say local, I just would like to see the minutes just slightly clarified so that it doesn't make it look like they have to live in Lake County or have to be, basically have to live or work in Lake County.
You know, and I think the intent was always that, and that was something that I would open the floor of for discussion for any of the GSPAC members. I think that was part of the charter drawing up of it, of having somebody who was local and had that kind of local, not necessarily institutional knowledge, but somebody who, you know, lived, worked, or otherwise within the basin, but completely, you know, open to discussion.
I think the charter just says that they will be approved by the members of the committee and the board. I don't think it really says anything about they shall be a resident of the Big Valley area or have knowledge of it or any of that. I think that's kind of between us and the board to think and say, okay, are they an appropriate person to have on the board or not? But,
okay. All right.
And I would, while we are reviewing the minutes, I would just like to pinpoint item 3, the review of the Brown Act requirements. We won't go into the detail that we went our last meeting from our county council that gave the presentation. I will be sure to get those slides from county council to share with the committee. I know that we were also provided an overview of the Brown Act and then some additional resources to the GSPAC, but I would just like to reiterate what county council had informed us. We are following the Brown Act closely, and that goes with conversation off the record as well. I discourage the GSPAC members to have conversations regarding the development of our Big Valley GSP plan. It's essential and crucial that we do make sure that we have these conversations on the record in the public eye to ensure that we are following those Brown Act requirements. We will be following that closely. And again, just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions or need clarifications on the Brown Act, I'm more than happy to follow up with you, provide additional information, but I will be sure to get those slides that county council did go over with us during our first meeting to everyone, just as a reminder. So yay, Brown Act.
Hey, Marina, can I go back real quick to that conversation we were just having about the local people, and the intent of this committee is to be made up of the local stakeholders, correct, Christy?
That is correct.
Okay, well,
That is, and I will say that there is no requirement that says exactly who that needs to be. Those are open, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the communication engagement section, just briefly, that we're doing. But that is up to whoever it is that's guiding and advising as part of the process. That's really left up to the local interpretation thereof, which would fall to all of you as the advisory committee to make recommendations for that to the board of directors of the BVGSA. Peter, did you have a question?
Yes, just very quickly about
Sure.
Marina on the Brown Act. It should also be noted that there was a clarification, which really constituted a slight correction of council's interpretation of the Brown Act as it related to communications between members. And I think that's noted later in the minutes, but I think it's important to note that there was that clarification.
Thank you, Peter.
So what I think we should do is we should amend the notes to make note of both Sarah and what Peter have just both brought up. And then Sarah, also in the notes for this particular meeting, I'd like it to reflect as well that that was brought up and that was open for discussion, and just as a point of that person not having a hard requirement by any regulatory language that says it's local, but that the interpretation of the GSPAC membership was that it would be somebody who has local ties.
Christy?
Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Local knowledge of the working knowledge of the basin.
You know, honestly, it's Sarah, for the reflection of this in the minutes, so that it correctly categorizes it for any further discussion points or for advisement to the board. You are welcome to term it however you like.
Yes, I mean, that was my understanding in the early days of the development of this committee, was that those seats were, that there was a, what do you call it? Basically, just kind of a look-see for parties that were had awareness and local knowledge of the groundwater basin and groundwater issues.
Christy, this is Brenna.
Yes.
I guess I had a bit of a different interpretation, and maybe we want to have an additional discussion to kind of clear up exactly what this language means, because as Sarah references, I think the semantics are important when we're thinking about additional committee members. I guess my interpretation was more that it would be a person with local ties, not necessarily that they have to live within the groundwater basin, because that was not specifically specified, but that there is more of a local influence in that committee member. It sounds like maybe this is something that the committee wants to clarify within kind of for our own, I guess, clarification moving forward. I know that, of the seats available, the domestic groundwater user is probably going to be a local resident. The disadvantaged community member, or underserved community member, I think is what they're calling it now, is also probably going to be a local person. And so I guess from my perspective, what seat is Sarah thinking could be taken by a non-local entity? Is she thinking the additional environmental seat? Were there other more local environmental persons or groups that we could get involved? I'm just wanting more clarification around this discussion, have us all come away with the same understanding.
Brenna, did you want me to answer that?
Yeah, Sarah, just who did you have in mind? I think you're referencing that specific seat, as the other two, I think, are probably going to be local, either residents or stakeholders.
Correct. Yes, absolutely, Brenna. It totally makes sense for a domestic well owner and the DAC seats to be local residents. When it comes to the environmental seat, when you're thinking about groundwater issues and the ability for somebody to provide environmental representation, the work that the local environmental groups do and I'm aware of them. I'm an environmentalist. I work in the environmental field, so I know the environmental groups. They have other, various topics that they're working on for sure. There are not a lot of environmental folks in the county working on groundwater issues and have knowledge of the groundwater basin or SGMA. And I know that there was already a push to fill these different categories, including this last environmental seat. So, and it was not filled. And so there are actually environmental groups that have working knowledge of the groundwater basin in Big Valley, who have commented on things before, who are very aware of SGMA and the requirements, and are environmental groups. And the reason why I'm requesting clarification on the local is because it's not these are not necessarily people who actually live in Lake County, but they are environmental people who work on basins and have been involved in the Big Valley basin work. So that's the reason. So that's where I'm going with this.
And if it helps for anybody, we can clarify the language to say that there would be, you'd have to have I think that's pretty clear that everybody is in agreement that having some type of groundwater or water resources knowledge is important for this person. So I think we're really coming down to the kind of that language of local. We could say that there would be a preference for, somebody who had that local tie to it. We can outright strike it entirely and not have that be a parameter going forward. We can also discuss that language a little bit more when we have our agenda item for the open seats, if there are people for the open seats. And we can do it one of two ways. We can do that now and go ahead and clarify that language, or we can do it as an ad hoc basis as each individual person would come up for those spots.
Christy, yeah, if I can respond to that, in however way we do it, I don't really have a preference or opinion. I'd say that, although I do say that if we can clearly define it before, or define that process before, that saves us work on the back end in the ad hoc process and gives everyone a clear understanding moving forward of what's required, what's expected. I would request that if we're going to leave the language in there of not specifically local or have local ties, that we specify that the person coming in has to have specific knowledge of Big Valley or background in Big Valley environmental work or background in the Big Valley groundwater hydrology, some sort of qualifying that we have, especially in the environmental seat coming in, if they have worked with Big Valley environmental issues or groundwater issues. I think that would be important to specify if they're not a local stakeholder.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think somebody qualifies as a local stakeholder just because they've worked in the basin before and is familiar with. I think that would be, it would seem to me that'd be more of a situation where you'd bring that person in as an expert to consult the group. I had a whole different opinion when this group was put together than what Sarah's talking about. The whole idea of this whole program was to make a local stakeholder group that could help advise the Board of Supervisors. Bringing in an expert from outside the area that's really not a stakeholder seems to not fly with that whole definition.
I think what we can do at this point is to go ahead, as Sarah had recommended, and remove the individual as local to Big Valley Basin in the minutes and going forward, even though that is the language that we have used prior. Now we've clarified it to be somebody who has knowledge of Big Valley Basin. And would you all be in agreement of saying someone who has worked in the Big Valley Basin? Peter?
Can I comment?
Sure.
This is a stakeholder group. That means that stakeholder is the important word. And that means that you have a personal interest in what is going on in connection with this basin. It's not, and I agree with Pat, it's not just technical expertise, it's a stakeholder. And so I would tend to want to stay with the language that's in the interpretation that's been in place. That's why we were recruited, is because we have an interest at stake. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
This is David. I agree with that. There's plenty of latitude in the charter to bring in experts as needed for whatever technical or technical issue we might encounter, and that the goal of this was to keep the interests and the focus of the comments among stakeholders and people with local ties. I think if we need outside opinions, we can get them from consultants as needed.
Sarah?
So given,
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead,
please.
Marina.
I was just going to call on Sarah to go ahead, but if you wanted to add a comment to David's comment.
No.
Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
I understand what Pat and others are saying about it. This, and yes, it makes sense. This is an environmental seat we're talking about, and it also makes sense to have people who have a working knowledge of Sigma, and we're supposed to be evaluating the environmental impacts of groundwater, of unintended groundwater circumstances that happen if it's not being managed properly. To be able to do that and to have that ability to evaluate the uses and to do that from an environmental perspective and not any other bias is really it's a tough place to be. And we're supposed to have 2 environmental seats. And with other environmental groups in the county not necessarily having focus on the groundwater, on Sigma. I mean, I haven't really seen much going on with the environmental groups about Sigma or about the Big Valley groundwater basin in general. No offense. I mean, they're working on other environmental issues, but this is a specialty. The environmental seat is supposed to be a specialty, just like agriculture and domestic well use are all specialties. And to have that working knowledge of the impacts on on natural resources, basically, is a specialty. So we don't necessarily have that in the county. But we do have it with people who have worked in the groundwater, who have working knowledge of the Big Valley groundwater basin. And, just to, if we want it to be for all of the seats to be filled with people who are going to be able to really bring a lot to the table, so that we're all looking at it in a full way, in a thorough way, in a balanced way. We need that environmental seat to be someone who will be able to understand the Sigma applications and requirements. So that's why I'm making making these points.
Okay. For the sake of time and for the information that we have to move through, I say that we focus first and foremost on the meeting minutes and just making the meeting minutes reflective of what the previous meeting was and what was discussed. And then I would like to suggest that we put in either an asterisk of some kind or something that modifies or opens up that local piece that we had in there. And then also that the meeting summary for this particular meeting definitely incorporates that discussion and those ideas into the meeting minutes. So I want to move beyond just the meeting minutes, and so that we can start to really dive into those open seats and spots. I do know that we do have at least one person who's here to state that they would like one of those spots. And so I want to be able to get to that. And I think it's the same discussion, but I do want to move beyond the meeting minutes, but I do want them to be reflective of this conversation. So that would just take somebody moving to have the meeting amendments added and then to be put forward.
I make a motion to approve the minutes with the added amendments. Can I get a second, please?
I'll second.
Thank you, David. And then let's go ahead
Can you
and
clarify what the amendment is?
Sure, there's two. So there's one that just calls out the specification of local to Big Valley Basin as the language that has been used to date to this meeting and through this meeting that was held previously. And just being reflective of the fact that that is a discussion point, and that would be the meeting minutes for that last meeting, not for this meeting, that it would just underline that and highlight that that is something that is a consideration in approving these minutes. And then the second piece is just the Brown Act clarification that that Marina had brought up. Those are the two. Okay.
And I'm going to go ahead and just do a roll call for those minutes approval. Brenna Sullivan,
Yes.
Pat Scully,
Yes.
David seconded, Peter,
Yes.
thank you, Sarah,
I'm going to abstain.
thank you, and then Scott Hornick,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. So also for the sake of not losing momentum in this conversation and staying with where we're at, I am going to suggest, Marina, that we flip items 3 and I believe it's 3 and 4,
Yeah,
and go ahead and talk about the open seats. And what we'll do is we'll proceed forward as I had detailed it out for this meeting, but then we can get into some of the other questions and things. And I think probably the best way, the best guidance that I can offer and how to go about this, and it is open to the GSPAC of how they want to do this, is for us to go on a case-by-case basis as people step forward to fill those open seats, to talk about the merits of the type of people to be in those seats. And by type, I mean the affiliations that they have, their ability to be a spokesperson for, and also to relay information back to whatever group it is that they would be representative of. And then also to talk about just suitability with background and experience of that person. I know sometimes these things can devolve into feeling a bit like a popularity contest or otherwise, but I think the focus should be on making sure that we fill those spots, knowing the incredibly fast timeline that we have to go through, but also filling them with the right people. So as we go forward, go ahead.
Sorry, Christy, can I ask a process question real quick?
You bet.
Okay, so are these kind of a first come, first served spot filling process, or are we going to set a deadline and accept applications or people coming forward and evaluate it after a certain set time?
That is up to all of you. There was not an application process put in place that usually comes from more of a voting body type situation. This is a consensus seeking group, and that's how it's specified in the charter. So it is open to how you all want to handle it. If we're trying to expedite having people in those spots so that we can move forward. All of these are public facing meetings, so nobody misses out on anything in any way, shape, or form. But, you know, you can take it as an ad hoc basis of who steps forward and say, yep, that would be a good fit for it. You could wait and hold it. That is really up to the group to decide.
so with that being said, we are going to do a flip-flop of item 3 and item 4 on the agenda. Let's jump right into item 4, specifically item 4.1. Reiterate open positions. Again, we are looking for environmental, domestic well owner, and disadvantaged community seats on our GSPAC and hear from the interested parties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kindly ask those folks that are interested in stepping up and potentially filling a position, just raise your hand. You can do the little, what we can do, like the raise hand via Zoom, where you can go like this, and then I will call on folks and then give you a few minutes. Let's just, to keep us on schedule, let's just give you roughly 3 minutes initially to lay out your name, your affiliation, etc. Before we do that, I do see we have a GSPAC committee member with a question, so I'm going to open that up to Sarah first before we dive into that.
Thanks, Marina. Just a process question, I guess follow up with Brenna. So is this the is this meeting going to be the meeting where everybody is invited and we're going to pick from this, since you're going to have them all introduce themselves?
So on the agenda item itself, it said about just reiterating the open positions and hear from interested parties is what the agenda item said. So the expectation is that people would step forward if they were interested in that particular position, state their name, which one they were hoping to vie for, and also their suitability for it. And at that time, the way in which this was envisioned as a consensus-seeking body is that there would be a recommendation made to forward somebody on to one of those spots, and then the consensus would be taken of just a roll of consensus, and then to put those people forward. So this group does not get to decide who that definitely is. That is up to the Board of Supervisors, the Board of Directors to do. And what you're doing is creating a recommendation to them of who that person might be for each of those slots. If that provides any.
Yep, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Thank you, Sarah, for that clarification. I'm going to open it up to participants. Again, please raise your hand. Once I call your name, I have a timer going right here, and then I will interject when you have a minute left, and then breaking it down into 30 seconds or so after that. So with that being said, do we have any participants right now who is advocating to fulfill one of those seats on our GSPAC committee? Members.
And Marina, I will also say that if you're having any type of troubles raising a virtual hand or not knowing how to do that, you're more than welcome to put your name and state your intent in the chat box as well, or to just wave us down if you need to do it that way. I know sometimes Zoom can be a little hard to deal with.
Thank you, Christy.
I don't know how to do that.
All right, so I see a hand raised behind David.
Yeah, so I'm Sky Hoyt, and David reached out to me about potentially being a member. So I'm expressing interest. I don't know if I convey it so far as being that I want to be involved. It's really been intriguing to listen to this. But I guess he mentioned to me that I would be a shallow well owner, and now I understand it's a domestic well owner. But I do have a well in the Big Valley Basin, and I own 2 other wells in Scotts Valley. I farmed local food in Big Valley from '92 until 2015. I still have that property there as ag property on reserve, but there's no commercial crop production happening there. I was an agricultural instructor at Mendocino College, so I'm connected in gardening. And so I did have a lot of contact with local gardeners during the 2014 drought, and I have experience with that. I do remember the 1977 drought. I was beginning in the nursery business in Sonoma County at that time. I continue to do hobby gardening, and I continue to be, vigorously interested in agricultural issues. I did serve as a volunteer with Dr. Pace last year on what was originally called the Farm Worker Advocacy Committee, and then it became the Latino Advocacy Committee or group. And that was a highly rewarding experience. So I know that's a brief statement. I don't know, maybe questions.
And just really quickly for clarification, Sky, is it the domestic well owner slot that you were looking to potentially fill?
Well, I'm not an environmental professional, that's for sure. And what was the other one? Yeah, and I don't think I don't understand disadvantaged. I very well may be disadvantaged, but no, I don't think I think someone else would be better for that.
Okay. All right. Okay. And is there anybody else today? Sarah, your hand's still raised. Did you have another question, or did you? I'm not sure you can vie for 2 spots at once.
No, I'm sorry. Oh, I'll do 2
We won't-
spots if I can have 2 votes. Yeah, no problem there.
We won't
but no.
give you double the work. Okay. Is there anybody else?
Valerie Nixon, go ahead.
Well, I feel like I've stepped into a controversy here, so I'm wondering if I should wait. I am the president of the Lake County Land Trust and am interested in this group, and I was invited by Peter Windrum. Our priority is our priority land acquisitions from our mission statement to conserve lands in Lake County is the Big Valley Wetland Basin. And in that, And that's the area between Clear Lake State Park and Lakeport. And right now we own 330 acres in that area. And we hope to restore the wetlands and the oak woodlands and the native vegetation in that area. All those rely on groundwater. I do not have expertise in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, but I'd be willing to work on getting there. I was a ranger at Clear Lake State Park for 22 years. And as many of you know, the state park actually destroyed the wetland where Kelsey Creek and Coal Creek used to have a little delta there. And they channelized them both, which affected that area greatly. And but I have watched over the years Kelsey Creek try to make it back to Coal Creek. So the Land Trust has real interest. I have access to Tom Smythe, who worked for Water Resources as an engineer and probably has expertise in SGMA. So I think I could be helpful, but I don't want to step in the middle of a big controversy. So.
Thank you, Valerie. Do we have anyone else?
And Valerie, just to clarify, the environmental position is the one that you would look to fill. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
All right. Okay, going once, going twice. All righty. I would like to open it up for any comments from the GSPAC members, and then we will open it up to the public for comment.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Peter.
As the person who invited Val to consider this position, I just want to say that I've had occasion to work with Val for many years, and particularly on land trust matters. I just know firsthand her commitment to environmental issues and preservation of natural resources. She's a very, very effective spokesman for those interests, and a person who, evidenced by her leadership position at the Land Trust as president, as well as the, I might say too, she just president of the Middle Creek Restoration Coalition, which is not Big Valley, but obviously involves so many of the same issues relating to water that I think she's highly qualified and a very, very excellent member of any committee and organization where consensus is sought.
One thing that I would like to ask both Sky and Val is any insight to the consideration that you take in this. We do have a lot of work ahead of us. It's a very hefty workload and we have a quickly approaching timeline. So do either of you anticipate any turbulence along the way? You know, oftentimes we'll be reviewing very large, a lot of number of page documents. I just want to make sure that you are willing to, you know, accept that workload that may come to be if you are, you know, selected to fulfill one of these seats.
Who goes first?
Nose goes. Go ahead, Sky.
Okay, so I talked with Christy on the phone yesterday and she talked about having to read thousands of pages of documents, and I thought that was probably a little much. You know, I don't know how you're going to get a citizen without, you know, without any direct economic interest to have that sort of commitment. So I would think that reading thousands of pages of documents would probably fall to paid staff, and the citizen would be there to ask for clarification or to ask, you know, suggest areas that were important or like that. So I guess it depends on how much you're talking about. But yeah, I mean, and we talked a little bit about the time involved, and I don't know that. So the question's a little bit leading and vague, but I mean, I am interested in the subject. And I think a lot of these things, I have thought about water and groundwater. I mean, as a farmer, I don't know if non-farmers can get it, but every time there's a frost night and you're out there pumping water, you're thinking about water. And every time you've got a huge economic investment, you're thinking about water. And if you farmed through a drought or been in an agricultural business through a drought, you're thinking about water. So, I mean, when we talk about, you know, how do wells work, where's the groundwater come from? These are not like new issues to me. I've been thinking about this all my adult life. So I hope that that background would prepare me for it. But I mean, some of this, I don't know, I'm not sure. 1,000 pages of technical documents, probably not going to keep right up on that, but that's just the truth. But I mean, and you know, I have other things I do, but I'm willing to commit a significant amount of time and a fair amount. I am retired. I'm disabled and retired. And I'm still busy, but because of that, I have a lot of time to think about things. And I saw that when I was working for Dr. Pace, volunteering for Dr. Pace, was that I had a tremendous amount of time to think about issues between meetings. And that, I think that was a very good thing, as opposed to people who are working and constantly involved in day-to-day management stuff. They may not have the same time for reflective thinking. So that might be a strength that I could bring to it.
So what I might suggest that we do, you know, and for the sake of time as well, is that we take this the first step, and now that people have started to come forward for this particular position, and we can clarify a little bit more about what those positions are that we've done through this process, I would ask to potentially go ahead and take a roll call of how people want to handle this. Do you want to go ahead and move forward and make recommendations in this particular meeting? Or would you like it to be pushed to the June meeting to be able to be reviewed or to be finalized at that meeting? You could also go to some type of application process. Again, this isn't a voting body, so it's not as a formalized process. It really is up to all of you who are sitting members as to how you would like to handle this. But I would say let's cross that threshold first and decide how it is that you want to handle this, and then we can go ahead and talk to the two people who have come forward to fill the positions.
Thank you, Christy, for keeping us on track. Do we have any GSPAC members who have a preference on which route we take?
I believe Pat has his finger up, maybe not his hand, but his finger up.
Go ahead, Pat.
I personally think both of these candidates would be valuable contributors to this group, and I'd be in favor of just going forward today, putting them forward to the Board of Supervisors as the candidates that we've chosen.
We do have one question that's in the chat in pertaining to this, and it's just clarification, Sky, for you about your domestic well that you have in Big Valley. Just checking to see that that's a domestic well, a little bit more information about that.
It's a long-standing well. It's 38 feet deep. I have a caretaker that resides there at the property. I'm there on a regular basis. I was already there today. I'm there almost every day now. We do sort of like hobby community gardening there. It's a fairly high producing well. We've got it set up 5 horsepower pump. It pumps 100 gallons a minute now. We've actually, I mean, I don't know, is that kind of what you're looking for? I mean, we've done a lot of work on that well. We actually had that well casing collapse. We learned a lot about the structures down there, and we recased it. We have a fair amount of experience with that, and with that, again, a lot of thinking about, well, how does groundwater work right in there?
Okay.
My residence is in Scotts Valley, though. That's my primary residence now. Does that address what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, and then Sarah did add a clarification: domestic well as drinking water well.
Yeah, the water, I would say the water, we can drink the water. It is potable. I like to import drinking water. It doesn't taste good enough for me. The water quality in there, to me, it's just not that great. It is potable water. It can be drank. The caretaker drinks it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I don't think he imports drinking water. I'm just not certain on that.
So Marina, as GSPAC leader, what I would suggest is that we do a roll call just to clarify how it is that we're going to do this process. If it needs to be pushed to an application process or a hold process that carries it over, or if it is just at each meeting as people come forward to either put that person forward and then to take roll call on each person to either make it a recommendation or not as a consensus type thing. Again, not a voting body making the recommendations, but I suggest that we go ahead and put that on the record of how we want to handle this first.
Okay. So then with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and do roll call. And then when I list your name, GSPAC members, please outline your preference for that if you do have a preference. So let's go ahead and let's go to Scott Hornig.
I think that they're both qualified and would be good applicants on it. And I think it's probably behooves us to get people on board now rather than later, since we're under such a crunch in time to get this plan together and wrapped up by the end of the year. So I would think that try to facilitate it as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Scott. Let's go ahead and do David Wise.
I also like both candidates and think they would both bring value to this discussion going forward. And I agree with what Scott said about the timing. I think the sooner the better.
Thank you, David. Let's go on to Pat Scully.
I'd be in favor of putting both candidates through as our selections today.
Thank you, Pat. Brenna Sullivan.
I agree. We're on a compressed timeline, so getting interested people on the committee as soon as possible is my preference. And given that these two people have stepped forward and given interest today, I'm comfortable moving forward.
Thank you, Brenna. Peter Windrum.
I agree with pardon me. I agree with what's been said by the previous three members.
Thank you, Peter. And then Sarah Ryan.
Well, after hearing Sky's description that as well as a domestic well, I think that, that he's eligible for that. And Sky obviously is an extremely knowledgeable person. So I totally understand moving him forward. And also, I did not realize Val Nixon was on the call. I think she's a very effective person. And so, yes, I support both of these moving forward to the Board of Supervisors. Thank you.
Thank you. And then
And
go ahead. I was just
no, I'd like the record to reflect that Kyle is not with us today and so can't levy up his opinion, but I just wanted to reflect that. And then Marina, of course, we also have to ask you because you are a sitting member, even though you're the lead, you're also the city member. So we need to ask you for yours as well.
Yes, I am in favor of moving both Sky and Val Nixon for Sky to fill the domestic well owner seat and then Val to fill the environmental seat.
Okay.
So with that being said, since we already did a roll call, all in favor, can you please say aye?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
No? All right. So with that being said, we will be putting in the recommendations. I will be bringing it to the Board of Supervisors once I get that date funneled down to make the amendment of our current charter to include Sky and Val. Before I do that, do we have any additional final comments from either both Sky or Val before you rally you in?
Thank you.
Thank you, Val. That's the spirit.
Marina, I have one more item that I would like to add as a change. If we're going to go ahead and do an amendment to add both those people to recommend that, I would also like to not necessarily recommend, but just change the language that's in the charter. It says sub-basin, it says Big Valley sub-basin, and it actually technically is Big Valley Basin on its own. It sits on its own and it's not a sub-basin. So when we do make the, go in front of the Board of Supervisors to make the amended changes, I would also like to suggest that we make that change as well, just to reflect the accurate, something that we've ferreted out in the GSP process of data analysis so far is that we want to make sure it's reflected as such.
Awesome. I will add that too. So once I get that item on the board agenda, I will be sure to share that with the GSPAC committee prior to submitting it on the agenda. Any other things for item number, technically 4, before we go back to item 3?
You know, and Marina, I would also suggest that item number 3 is an educational step towards the next meeting. And so I would like to say that I would like to move, we're right on time now for where we should be for opening it up for the sustainable management criteria discussion that Ibrahim's going to be leading for us. And I know that that's a very good technical overview discussion that everyone's going to want to have. So I would suggest we go ahead and go forward with that. And then we can do our public comment period. If there's time at the end, we can go over the communication and engagement plan. If not, we can certainly move that towards the next meeting. There were no recommendations or anything we were seeking off of that.
Okay. All righty. Thank you, Christy. So with that being said, let's go ahead and pass it on to Ibrahim for his item. And Ibrahim, I did make you a co-host, so let me know if you need me to do anything in terms of helping sharing your screen.
Hey everyone, this is Ibrahim Kadam. I'm with Stantec on the technical team. Thanks, Marina. Let me know if you can see my screen. I'll be attempting to share my screen here.
And as Ibrahim pulls that up, I will let everybody know that there is another face that's missing, and that's Eddie Teasdale, who is also our co-project manager with Ibrahim, and he is in Hawaii. So we told him not to log in, but he will be with us for future meetings. So.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Well, yes, there we go.
Yes.
Does it show the presentation?
It does. You're good.
Okay, perfect. So today we will be discussing the sustainable management criteria. From the presentation that Eddie gave last time, he went through and described the general content of the GSP, which is have 5 big blocks. Describe the basin where we at, talk about technically the geology and the hydrogeology. Part 3, which we're going to focus on today, is how we're going to measure sustainability. And then 4, defining the programs and projects needed to achieve or maintain sustainability. And finally, the GSP implementation, how we're going to fund it, who will be responsible for actions, and so forth. So part 3 deals with defining the sustainability, how it is measured, and before that, maybe just take a step back and ask a question: what is sustainable groundwater management? Again, it's a policy focused on that has to be built on technical data that provide a unified goal for the basin, and that will guarantee sustainability is achieved within 20 years of the GSP implementation, and then it has to be maintained beyond that without causing any undesirable results. So the goal of the discussion today is for us to take a step back and say, yep, in just this couple of slides, I mentioned a number of terminologies, and there will be a number of terminologies. We need to be aware of what those mean specifically in the Sigma language, and that will help us all will be on the same page. So those terms are what is a sustainability indicator? What is an undesirable results? Monitoring network, minimum threshold, measurable objectives, interim milestone, and baseline condition. These general terms, everyone knows what this means. However, they do have a very specific technical and legal definition within Sigma, and that's kind of the nuance we want to go through today. The very first concept is the sustainability indicators. And so for the sustainability indicators, we refer to the effects caused by groundwater conditions occurring throughout the basin that when significantly and unreasonable cause undesirable results. So the indicators are our way of knowing or the measures that we look at to know if there is if there's something good or bad happening in the basin. So there is 6 indicators defined by regulations. Lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of storage, seawater intrusion, degraded quality, land subsidence, and surface water depletion and that's basically focusing on those surface water bodies that are connected to the groundwater, and then groundwater actions and extraction will result in the depletion of these surface water. So those are the 6 indicators that we are required to look at. In our basin here, we don't have seawater intrusion to worry about, so that's why it's X'd out. So that means we're only focusing on 5. And then with those sustainability indicators, each one of them is associated with a metric that we have to measure. So groundwater elevation is tied to the first indicator. We need to measure and account for the total volume of water in the groundwater basin and how that volume changes up and down. That's the second indicators. For the water quality, there is a number of indicators. They're not asking us to use all of them, but depending on our situation, we need to look at certain water quality indicators. Like we typically look at total dissolved solids as an indicator of salinity. We look at nitrates as an indicator of potential widespread pollution from agricultural practices or livestock practices or dairies in the area. We can look at if there is specific known plumes of contaminant in the area. We can look at if there is specific other indicators, for example, related to drinking water standards that we can look at. Land subsidence, that's basically where we look at the extent of the ground surface and how far it subsides due to extraction and sustainable extraction of groundwater. And then the surface water depletion, the volume or rate of how much and how fast surface water is leaving the streams and creeks as a result of groundwater pumping. The next definition that's closely tied to the discussion about indicators and sustainability is the undesirable results. Specifically, the regulation says undesirable results are any of the following effects caused by groundwater condition occurring throughout the basin. Kind of listen closely to some of the terms here that I'm going to highlight. One of them is, it says chronic lowering of groundwater, indicating a significant and unreasonable depletion of supply, significant and unreasonable reduction of storage, significant and unreasonable seawater intrusion, significant and unreasonable. You get the point. It's all about this kind of vague words about significant and unreasonable. So it begs the question, so what is significant and unreasonable? This is where the GSA and you guys come in here. The significant and unreasonable is defined by the GSA, is defined by us. So we have to sit back as we present technical data and decide what level, as the groundwater goes down, what level we in this basin consider significant and unreasonable. Again, it's not completely subjective, it has to be objective. So we have to say, we will consider, for example, this level of reduction in the groundwater levels significant and unreasonable if it will result, for example, in dewatering all of the domestic wells, or a portion, or maybe half, or maybe 25% of the domestic wells. Or we could go extreme and say it will be unreasonable if it results in dewatering any single domestic well. That's probably too extreme, but that could be, it's in our hand to define. Same thing too about the depletion of interconnected surface water bodies that have significant and unreasonable adverse impact on the beneficial use of the surface water. So again, vague definition, but this is basically the latitude provided by the Sigma regulation for the local control. We have to look at our surface bodies, determine which one have connection to the groundwater basin, and then we decide, then we look at all of the beneficial uses. Those could be environmental uses, could be including fisheries, ecosystem, could be recreation, could be surface water diversions for irrigation out of these streams. And then we define a level of reduction in the surface water that we will consider significant and unreasonable. And then that becomes the criteria that then will drive the rest of the process. So this concept of significant and unreasonable is a very, very critical point for us to keep in mind. So, as I said, a significant and unreasonable, and on all of the indicators, and the whole Sigma is geared toward the scientific and evidence-based process. So as such, we must have a monitoring system that allow us to understand what the conditions are, allow us to define what's the undesirable results. So Sigma also have this specific term which is called representative monitoring network. Within Big Valley, there is a number of wells being monitored. We do not have to include all of them in as we develop our sustainability criteria. We have to select a subset. I mean, we could include all of them, but typically we include a smaller subset of this monitoring network that we deem representative. And why we focus on a subset? Because each point or each monitoring location we pick, we have to look at all the sustainability indicator at that location. So we have to look at elevations, we have to look at quality, and then the network we select has to have good spatial and temporal coverage. And at each one of those locations, then we have to define two important levels: a minimum threshold and a measurable objectives. You can think of like a minimum level below which we're in trouble, and a good measurable objective, a really good level that we're striving towards. And so for each network we pick, we have to define these two levels. So that's why we always like to select a subset of the network that is geographically spread, that have a good coverage that we could use. And remember that we need to have the monitoring networks, actually 6 of those, one for each one of the sustainability indicators. So what is the official definition of a minimum threshold? It's a numeric value for each sustainability indicator used to define the undesirable results. So remember we talked about the undesirable or results, insignificant and unreasonable results. Those results would occur if our indicator, for example, say groundwater elevation dropped below this level. So any place below this level, we're going to see the undesirable results. And then on the other hand, what the measurable objectives are. They refer to specific quantifiable goals to maintain or improve groundwater conditions to achieve the sustainability goal. So that's kind of the idea here of a combined saving and a checking account, where below a certain level you're gonna into overdraft. That's basically where you want to be. This is the good place you want to be at, and this is your goal. In 20 years, you want to be way up here, have this extra savings. And so basically, we'd like to have at least we need to be above this level to weather changes in hydrology, the drought, and different conditions. We need to be all above this level. So this is again looking at the minimum threshold. We have a groundwater basin, we have a monitoring network, all of these wells. We're going to select, for example, in this place, we select 5 representative sites. That's kind of how the process works. And then for each site, we're going to develop the minimum threshold. Again, this minimum threshold, this is an important concept, could be and most likely will be different by location. So for this location, the minimum threshold has to be, for example, if this is elevation, could be 100 feet below ground surface. Here could be 50 feet, here could be 120, depending on the geology, the groundwater flow condition. So each location will have just a minimum threshold that is justified by evidence. And we are striving that our groundwater condition to be above this minimum threshold. Below that, this is where the undesirable result occur. By 2020, for example, we're going to have the GSP submitted to DWR by end of 2021, submitted to DWR. And then the goal is to, as we implement over the next 20 years, we need to maintain the groundwater condition above this minimum threshold. In fact, we have to define for each one of these locations a measurable objective. Basically, the ideal place would like to be, and we would be striving to achieve that over 20 years. So here in Big Valley, I think generally not speaking out of order, but I think we're dealing with a fairly decent groundwater condition, not like other part of the Central Valley where they're starting from a big hole and trying to build up. And so we worked in basins where actually right now they're achieving sustainability right now. And so their goal is to maintain sustainability rather than achieve sustainability. So there is that flexibility too. But this is basically the concept of the measurement objective, a goal that you work towards and you want to achieve in 20 years. The next terminology is the interim milestone. It's a target value representing measurable groundwater condition in increments of 5 years that is set up. So that's assuming that we are starting from a hole and we wanted to achieve an objective. We defined our minimum threshold, and guess what? Right now we're starting from a point, we're below the minimum threshold. So we will say in 5 years, our interim milestone is to achieve this much. In the next 5 years, we need to be here, and then finally, and then the next 5 years, by 2035, we reach this point, and by 2040 or 20 years from the GSP implementation, we achieve our measurable objectives. So we may or may not need to set interim milestone, depending on the starting condition for our basin. The other terminology that's defined in regulation is the baseline conditions. It refers to the historic information used to project future conditions for hydrology, water demand, and availability of surface water to evaluate potential sustainable management practices of a basin. So right now, the technical team is in the process of looking at the historical data, trying to define what does the baseline condition looks like. So for demand, it's easy. For water demand, it's easy. It's kind of existing condition right now. So we're looking at the urban, so some of the existing plans between 2015 and 2020, looking at what that demand levels look like based on the land use, if it's ag, or for the water use based on the urban municipalities. So that will be the demand. However, for the hydrology and the surface water, we need to go back for about a longer period, probably somewhere around 30 years, to have a good coverage of wet, dry, and average years. And that becomes our historical baseline that we're going to establish for hydrology. And then the demand. So we're assuming that that's basically how the hydrology will look like over the last 30 years. And then when we look into the future, we look at how the demand will grow into the future based on either changes in land use, expansion in urban development, and or changes in ag practices, intensification, and so forth. And at the same time, we do two things. And when we look at the historical hydrology, we assume one, the historical hydrology is going to repeat itself. And so we kind of just assume the hydrology will repeat itself with the cycles of wet and dry and average years. And then on top of that, and then we look at the impact of the demand increase of changes and how that, when land using changes, and how that will affect groundwater sustainability. That's step one. Step two, then we will take that historical hydrology too and impose and superimpose climate change on top of it to see how the climate change we're gonna stress out the condition in the future. This is also part of the requirement of the GSP. So, so those are the terminologies. So now, what are we gonna do to develop these sustainability criteria? I mean, as you can think about it, we're trying to develop 3 levels. One is the ideal condition, which is the management objectives, MOs, management objectives, measurable objectives, or what we call the health range. So that's the ideal, what we like to see in the future, so that all of the beneficial uses, environmental, urban, ag, domestic users, everything is met, everything is beautiful. We need to kind of decide what those looks like. We also, on the other end, we need to define the significant and unreasonable, or the unhealthy levels defined by the minimum threshold. And basically that, in other words, is what do we absolutely don't want to see happening in our basin? And then between these two, we need also to set up what we call triggers or warnings, that we are getting closer. We don't want to hit the minimum threshold and then start to say, well, what do we need to do? We need to have in place triggers, because you don't want to hit that minimum threshold. Otherwise, you will end up, you will be at the mercy of the state intervention. The Stillwater Board coming up with interventions in the basin, taking control and doing doing other actions. And so we set triggers to see what we can develop the levels. So the very first question we will be struggling with over the next couple of months is what's healthy versus unhealthy in our basin, and also what is the unreasonable results, what viewer is about. And to do that, we need to establish the current and historical groundwater condition. And so that's kind of what are we working on right now. The technical team is pulling all data, and we already gonna put out a data request for all of the stakeholders to help us if they have additional data on groundwater levels, storage, water quality issues. Could be a big one in this basin. Any observed land subsidence, although historically this area is not of risk for land subsidence. Other big topics is the identification of interconnected surface water systems, and importantly also identification of groundwater dependent ecosystems in this area, and how the groundwater management affect them. So all of this package is part of the work we're doing right now. We're hoping to get all this information kind of compiled and out for review by the GSPAC members here in the next 2 to 3 weeks, hopefully ahead of our next GSPAC meeting. With that, I'd like to invite Christy to kind of help us. First of all, I want to pause and see if there's any questions on the concept we discussed, and then we'll open it here for a discussion item. Okay. If there's no question, Christy, I'd like you to kind of help us in this next conversation, and I would like to hear from, and the technical team overall would like to hear from the GSPAC members here about their impression about the health of the groundwater basin in Big Valley, and looking at these the 5 indicators applicable to our basin, which one do you think would possibly cause a concern now or in the future?
And so just as some guidelines as we go forward, this is just for the GSPAC members to make a discussion. We'll open it up for public comment a little bit later if there's something to be said. And I do want to note that this conversation that Ibrahim is trying to generate information for is a little bit of the conversation that we had with each of the stakeholders when we did the assessment originally in talking about all these. So I'll be interested to see how things might have changed from when we had those discussions last summer to now, but really just kind of walking through and getting everybody's take on where they think the basin sits with these undesirable results.
David, I see his hand raising his hand. David?
It's Sky, actually.
Hey, Sky.
I have at least 2 questions. One is on this, I guess you call it the screen sustainability indicators under degraded quality. I noticed you mentioned in your narrative, you mentioned specifically total dissolved solids and nitrates, which I think are absolutely essential in evaluating irrigation suitability, but I don't see them on the screen. So I'm wondering if that's significant that they aren't on there, or where would they be included in the screen list of topics?
Yeah, under the degraded water quality, we actually have additional metrics that we will be looking at, including TDS, nitrate, as well as also we will be looking at some of the municipal wells, looking at some of the drinking water standards. So those are not listed, but definitely will be looked at.
Okay, and then one further question. I think there were on the map, well, the second map, it showed 5 sites for monitoring wells. Can you tell us where they are? I mean, was that something we probably all want to know in some very identifiable way, exactly where those wells are, you know?
No, this is a cartoon from DWR, but let me actually go. This is a map that show, this is still work in progress, but this shows all of the wells we were able to identify until last week. That include irrigation, residential, stock watering, and other wells. Doesn't include the municipal wells yet. So all of the wells that's right now we're in the process of identifying and collecting all of the wells in the Big Valley. As part of the work we're doing here, we're gonna produce a map showing the wells that's being right now monitored by Department of Water Resources, all of them in the valley and their location. And so that will be part of the package going out for review here in the next 2 weeks.
Hey, Ibrahim, this is Brenna Sullivan. I have a quick question. So,
Huh?
so when looking at kind of, because this relates back to your question about what are our perceived understanding of the current current status of the Big Valley groundwater basin. So in looking at the long-term, you're referencing going back 30 years and looking at the long-term water supply in Big Valley groundwater basin. Are you looking at the specifically well levels that through the Lake County Monitoring Network at a specific time of year, or are you looking at the seasonal change between spring and fall? Are you modeling changes with that versus precipitation by year? How granular are you getting in that kind of overall picture of looking through the data that Lake County Water Resources has?
This is a really good question. We have to look at all these level of detail and all of these scales you mentioned. So we will be looking at them over a long period, over 30-year plus, looking at differences in wet, dry, and average years. We'll be looking at them by monthly, by season, how they look. We need to look at the recharge during the spring, and then we need to look at the groundwater use during the fall, how low they go. And that becomes part of discussion for how we set up the minimum threshold. For example, in some basins, we set up the minimum threshold to describe the health of the basin based on the spring levels. And in other basin, we set them based on the fall levels. And in other basin, we use the mix. So it all depends on when we put all this data and all of this description, we look at it, what are we worried about? And then we will be taking all of that. So sorry, Brennan, but we want to take all that and we're putting it into develop a groundwater model. And so the model then will be calibrated to fit the observed historical pattern, but then the model will allow us to tweak it and say, hey, what happens if we have more ag in this area, more intensified ag, and what happens if we have more urban development, and what happens if we have something happening in Scott Valley, how that will affect the Big Valley. All of these things we will be able to experiment with and test in the model.
So Pat, sorry, let me jump in to ask a quick follow-up question. So that specific seasonal change that you're modeling from spring to fall, are you? I didn't know if I think I missed it. Are you correlating that to precipitation, to annual precipitation? Are you correlating it to kind of trying to correlate with like 2 to 3 year rates in precipitation or changes in irrigation rates, if we can get that data?
The groundwater model that we will be developing will incorporate all these factors. So the groundwater model will have would have actually like multiple components. One component would be accounting for the precipitation. So those will be a monthly time series of precipitation each month, what the precipitation looks like over a long period. And we will be able to model how the groundwater system respond to precipitation, high or low precipitation. We will also be having a surface water model component, which looks at the stream runoffs, all the runoff coming through the different creeks and their interaction and their infiltration into the basin. We'll be looking at also developing a water budget for the ag system based on the land use and the detailed grid level for each representation of the crops, and estimate of how much water is applied to each type of crops, ET, and runoff, and then estimating how much would be the percolation down from the irrigation into the groundwater basin. All of those, and then we'll also be looking at the groundwater budget itself, so how much water is percolating down, and the flux is going to the adjacent basins, out or in, going to Clear Lake, and then all that together will allow us to look at like a 3D picture about how the groundwater basin is behaving. So it will be a very complete model, and we'll have a specific discussion in the next meetings about how this model is set up and how it will be run, and how you will look at the data from that model.
Okay, Ibrahim, I believe you have a question that Pat had his hand raised, and then Ngodu has her hand raised as well. So we'll go in that order.
Okay.
I just had a comment on you mentioned going back 30 years on the well logs. I would think that, I think the county has good information going a lot further back than that. And I would think it would behoove you to look at least a period somewhat before the 1976-77 drought, which is similar to what we're going through right now, to see how the basin reacted and how it came back after we got a normal rainfall season.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have data going back to the 50s and 40s, if I'm not wrong. The challenge is we have long data for some wells and not all the wells. And so to be able to do a good job in the model development calibration, we need to look at the period that have the most coverage for all the wells. But definitely we'll be looking at the past long historic and how the basin has behaved during these historic droughts. Ngodu?
I'm sure to an extent you could extrapolate where the wells that you don't have would have been relative to the other ones. I mean, I think that's
Yes.
information that's really pertinent to what we're experiencing right now.
True.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Godo Atsume. The N in my name is silent. I guess my question is just a follow-up to what you answered. I was going to ask the time frame of the wells you're looking at, particularly for domestic wells, and the process you're going to use to identify wells that are no longer active and wells that are active. I think that's important to have when you're putting in your representative monitoring network. And if you're going to prioritize domestic well density, is that part of the work you're going to put in place? And I think particularly the time frame, what is the boundary you're looking at for domestic wells?
Yeah, for the domestic, that's a good question, Gudu. So the domestic well data is based on a DWR database for well logs. And so we have been downloading that database that include all the permitted wells in the county, and those wells basically, when you build a well, you have to submit a permit for application, and then you get also the driller who built the well submit a well log about the location, how the well is constructed, and so forth. And so that all that information right now is housed in the state. So we downloaded that data, and we're kind of going through the data, and that's kind of what you see here. The question about active versus inactive wells, that's kind of a little bit tricky. It's as good as the data that has been that's available right now. I know we worked in other basins when we had a little bit more time than 8 months to do this, and we, in collaboration with some of the local entities, we've done actually physical surveys, and went out to the field, and we kind of did a physical surveys. I'm not sure if that's something we could do right now based on the time we have and all of the restrictions we have so far. But it will be good also to, as we put the data out and the information out about the density of the residential wells and where the well location is be good also for locals here to kind of provide feedback if they see any inaccuracies. And that could be one of the actions we lay out in the GSP implementation. Like once the GSP is implemented, we need to go out and systematically look out at collect more data on wells. One of the key problems we see with the data so far is that the depth of the wells is fairly incomplete. It's there as inconsistent and incomplete, but that's something we'll definitely will present and look at.
Wait, can I ask a follow-up question? When you say the depth of the well is incomplete, does that mean that they didn't include it?
It's included for some, and it's not included for others.
Okay, and the reason I ask that is because there should be priority to shallow domestic wells, because in a drought year such as this, they are the ones that go dry first. So I think the well depth is an important data to also pull out. Thank you.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you. Sarah?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, a couple of questions about your presentation. The first is, there isn't a lot of data for most of the monitoring wells in the Big Valley Basin. There's maybe just a couple of measurements. So how do you expect to develop a robust model with limited data? And then the second question is, there's been a lot of change in crop types in the Big Valley Basin since prior to the last big drought. So really there's, the impact of climate change is going to be a real important factor to be looking at in terms of the modeling. And then also, how are you planning on calibrating your groundwater model with stream flow?
All good questions. I'll start with the easy one and then go to the difficult ones. So land use, not the difficult one, not the easy one, but the most important one in my mind. The land use is one of the critical issue we already have identified, the technical team. Luckily, DWR have done a detailed land use survey in 2018. And so we are in contact with DWR right now to get some of these data processed that looks at crop types as of 2018. So 3 years old, it's still decent, but does not capture the recent changes. And so that will be the foundation for our land use. However, we all recognize that because of not just because climate change, but also because of the economics changes, there is a widespread shift in cropping patterns in this area and in general in the state. So there's a lot of intensification in cannabis, in other product, shift to vineyards, and another type of shifts in land use. And so as we review the general plans from the county and from the ag commissioner in the county, we don't see these reflected in terms of projection into the future, 20 years out and 30 years out. We don't see there's no strong predictions for what's gonna happen. And this in our mind, this is a critical gap, information gap, that we would like to have your help as the GSPAC members and knowledgeable of it, local to come up with to provide feedback about what you envision and what do you see the trend happening in the basin right now, and reasonably what we could foresee happening. Is ag going to expand geographic footprint, or what type of shift we see in crop types or level of intensification, because it have important impacts on water use. Your other questions regarding the availability of and quality of data for model calibration. Yep, that's a concern. Just from the look of what we have right now, there is decent amount of monitoring data. We actually worked with much worse in other basins, and so it's not all bad. There is actually decent data that goes back many years, and luckily the groundwater basin here, the footprint of the basin is small compared with other basins. So I think we feel fairly reasonably, knock on wood, confident that we would have enough to get the model calibrated. The next question about the stream interaction between the streams and the connection between the streams and the groundwater basin, and that's a challenge. I won't lie about this. It's a challenge, not here only, but everywhere. This is a big question and a big challenge, establishing that. And so we have to, in this area, one of the biggest boundary condition we're dealing with is actually Clear Lake. It's where the discharge is going, and then we we need to basically work with our geologists to look at the pattern of the runoff from the different streams. If I have a problem, actually, I will have a problem with the gauging stations on the streams, on the creeks and the streams. That will be my most worry about having that data, because without accurate representation of how the stream data upstream and downstream, how the flow looks, if there's any diversions, just because you need to do accounting first of the surface water bodies. You need to get that accounting right before you talk about the interaction about the surface water and groundwater, and that's will be a challenge, but that's something we will be working on. I'm gonna put out of order, Christy, but I'm going to put a little bit of advertisement here. We will be setting up an ad hoc, requesting you guys approve ad hoc committees where we work with a few folks, on certain technical topics that could be GDEs or groundwater models or sustainability criteria, to work intensely, like 2-3 meetings a month, to get the technical detail and information worked out before we come and present it to the full GSPAC. And I'd love for you guys, some of you who are interested will be part of these discussions.
And just to follow up on that too, really quickly, Ibrahim, for the subcommittees and the ad hocs, which the charter made wide berth for, at our next meeting, in the June meeting, that is an agenda item for us to outline those a little bit more in detail, to let everyone know what's coming in that kind of June through, for all intents and purposes, probably October timeframe of the really intense review, and look at those. So those, we will detail those in the June meeting.
I see Peter's hands up.
Just a quick question. I'm puzzled by on the diagram that we're looking at, the designation of Scotts Valley and Big Valley, and then the explanation Big Valley subbasin. That's not where I know Scotts Valley to be. And
Yeah.
It looks like the outline is really the totality of Big Valley. So am I missing something?
No, you're correct. This is Big Valley, and
yes.
Scott Valley is here, and so this is Scott Valley. I think this is just mislabeled. Again, this is work in draft. This is a rough draft. So yeah,
okay.
I agree. This is a Big Valley Basin, and this is Scott Valley. We will have a much better maps in the report in 2 weeks. I promise.
Oh, that's okay. That's just fine. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
And Ibrahim, for the sake of time, I know that we would definitely want to leave room for any public comment on things that weren't agenda items. So as we move forward, just move along.
Yep. So I'm done with my piece. I open the floor for discussion, wanting to hear from the members. I'm not sure how you want to handle that conversation, Christy.
Sure. You know, I would just open it up that if there was anything else that anybody would want to be reflective early, knowing that there will be many, many chances to talk about the sustainability indicators and those undesirable results, but just anything else that the technical team that you might want to give them a heads up for, or let them know as we're pulling data and putting things together.
I have a question. I don't know how to raise my hand using that little yellow thing that everyone else knows how to do, but I'll just wave. And the question is, Ibrahim, you mentioned when you're talking about demand and, you know, looking back 30 years for hydrology and, you know, the various, the historical data that we have. But you also said, you talked about overlaying or superimposing, I think you called it, climate change impacts. And I wondered, is that historical climate change, or is that some sort of predictive modeled climate change that you're going to use? How will that come about and be used?
We'll be looking at future climate change, and typically, and that information is provided by DWR, Department of Water Resources, to look at the future impacts of climate change. And the way we model and with the way we look at the climate change here in the modeling, not probably the appropriate way, but basically we think about there is two levels that you deal with. First, there is the typical variability between dry and wet years, and that has been in the past, and that likely will continue in the future. But on top of that, there is also an additional shift because of the future climate change, and so that's why we bring the historical hydrology, and then we superimpose this additional shift, basically making things more drier or more wet or more hot than what used to be in the past. That's kind of what I meant.
So will you run scenarios based on different assumptions, or will you?
Yes.
Is there a standard that you're working with across the whole state of a sort of a standard climate change model that you're using, or what?
Correct. Yes, there's a standard set of scenarios, assumptions produced by DWR. It varies by region a little bit, just because of the differences in location within the state and topography and mountains and stuff like that. So there's a little bit different, but DWR published guidance on different regions, what you do expect in terms of changes in temperature, and changes in precipitation, and so forth.
Thank you.
Sarah, did you have another question, or was your hand still raised from the previous one?
Sorry about that.
Okay.
No worries. I always hesitate to put them down for people, so.
So, Christy, I'd like just kind of to invite Megan just kind of to provide a quick overview about the next anticipated sections coming out for review. Let me just.
And as we introduce Megan, I want to say that she may be a new face to all of you, but I can assure you that there's probably nobody working harder behind the scenes right now to make things happen and start to draft chapters and bring things together than Megan. So.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah. So thank you, Megan. We're gonna have 2 sections out for review in the next couple weeks. So probably by June 11th, we will likely send out the first 2 sections of the GSP for review by the GSPAC members, and we'll make them also available to the public. Go ahead, Megan.
Sure. So Ibrahim, if you could go to slide 16, I will be brief so we have time for the rest of the.
Which slide I'm showing right now?
You're showing 18.
Oh.
There we go. So I'll be brief. I just want to kind of assuage some fears. These chapters are not very long and they're not super technical. So I think one is 15 pages and it has a big table at the end. And so that's most of it. And then the next one is also 15 pages. So it's not super detailed and technical just yet. So section 1 is just the intro and to say, here's the GSP, here's who's going to be overseeing it. So the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. So it's very much just context setting. And there are 2 sections in here that give kind of a precursor to what is to come. And that is the sustainability goal and the estimated implementation costs. And right now it has a lot of blanks. And so it's meant to have blanks because we haven't gotten to those sections yet. So if you have comments on the sustainability goal and what that should be, you can offer those now, but that's going to be a really focused discussion in weeks to come. So again, it's just kind of very much boilerplate. Here's insert what we think the text will be. So don't be alarmed when you see that there are blanks, they're meant to be there. So that's just the introductions, but a lot of the information that we'd like to get back from you is on section 2.1, which is the basin plan, or yeah, the planet area. So that's the next slide, Ibrahim. Oh. There we go. So this part of section 2. So section 2 has kind of the context setting of here's a historical information and just background, and then The other half, back half of section 2 is getting into the more technical information about the hydraulic a lot of the technical information. So the first piece of section 2.1 is just discussing who has jurisdiction in here. So that's everything from the tribes to the communities to any public lands, and giving a little bit of context setting there about who these people are and what is important in Big Valley. The next piece of it is land use. So I know we've had some questions already about what kind of land use we're considering. So we have a historical look. We have some data that DWR produced back in 2001, 2003, 2013, some 2015 data and 2018 data. So that's a discussion there, but we would love to get your feedback on, if there's any things that we need to be kind of thinking about. As Ibrahim said, we understand that patterns of agriculture have changed. And so if there are any additional information, that would be an area that we could definitely use all of your local knowledge and input on. We also discuss in that section about historical trends in population and anything that would impact water demand. So if there are developments that are planned, whether that is in terms of housing or some industry that you know of, that would also be something. So I know William on my behalf has asked several of you questions. And so that's kind of to help fill in the sections for land use and also water use. So water use gets into things like what's the agricultural water demand then? What is the municipal and domestic well water demand then? Also touching on surface water and overall just groundwater use. Then after that, we get into some of the programs that are going on in terms of monitoring and management. So we talk about things like the IRWM plan, the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan, or we talk about the various DWR programs that they have in place to monitor wells or surface water quality or, gauges on Kelsey Creek. So it just really gets into a description of what programs are currently in place. Now, when we talk about that monitoring network that Ibrahim was mentioning earlier, that's going to be, this is a kind of a little bit of a precursor, but just more about what's being done already and has been done in the past. Then there's some additional GSP elements, and that's something that DWR asks for. This is the outline from DWR, so we try to make it as easy for them to review, and they have a section called additional GSP elements. And those are things like about well abandonment policies and groundwater recharge. And those pieces are going to be sprinkled throughout the rest of the document. And so that section is more of just like a, hey, this is what DWR asked for, this is where to find it. And then the notice and communication section, this is just really a precursor to all of the content we're going to be talking. Just mention the outreach and engagement plan, and that will be itself in its own section. So this is just to say, hey, this is what we've done, but please see this other section for the whole detailed list and all of the information in a subsequent section. So that's some kind of precursor to what you can expect to see. Like I said, it's not super technical at this point, not super long at this point, but we would super appreciate your feedback and making sure that we can ground truth it and it's as complete and accurate as possible. So that's all I have on sections 1 and 2.1.
Thank you for the preview, Megan. Ibrahim, was there anything else in your section that you wanted to go over or to highlight? Oh, you're on mute, Ibrahim.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for everyone. We are moving ahead. We're working hard, collecting a lot of data, processing it, and you will start to see sections slowly coming out for your review. Will ease you into the GSP here in the next 2 weeks. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We will now move into a very promised section of every single one of our meetings that we have, and that is our public comment period. They will be included in every meeting that the GSPAC has. But I also want to say that in addition to the oral public comments that we give space for in each of the meetings, we really, really invite people to put written comments into us, and I will share in the chat what that email address is. And if anything that you would submit, if you would just put GSPAC in the subject line, that's super helpful for us to just be able to filter the results. Anything that gets sent into that email address will be compiled as a record and then shared with GSPAC members. So they will be processed in their entirety and compiled for everyone. So definitely want to make sure that people are continually sending us information and comments that way. But I do want to open the floor for any type of public comment on either anything that we've talked about on the agenda or non-agendized items today. And you can do that by raising your hand, flagging us down, or whatever works best. At this point, everybody, I think, is ready for a bio break. And the Friday before a long weekend. All right. Ngodo, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a quick question.
Sure.
I might have missed this. Did Megan or Ibrahim provide a date of when the chapters will be out for review by the public?
Sure.
First
They said June 11th is their target to have it ready to be prepared. And then so technically the Brown Act says that things need to be put up 3 days before, but we're going to try to get those chapters and anything to people with as much time as we can to review it. So just as soon as it clears, you know, the cycle here on our end of the contractors and putting it together, then it would be released to everyone at the same time for review. And then it will actually be an agendized item for the June meeting where we will walk through them, both of them, both those chapters. As we wait to process to see if there's anything anybody else has to ask, I'll just really quickly go over at our June meeting that we will be doing education, much like we did with the sustainable management criteria today. We'll be going over some of the modeling and also the communication engagement plan that we punted down the road to that time period, the chapters 1 and 2, and then also looking at some of the groundwater conditions and getting just little updates on things that might be contemporary topics that might impact things. So one of the things we talked about is having drought related information that kind of kicks off each of those meetings, especially since we're in the middle of it, and bringing to bear the fact that we have good water resources connections to share. So that's what the June meeting will look like. Are there any other comments from anybody? Okay.
Hey, Christy.
You bet, Sarah.
Did you mention that the June meeting was also going to have a discussion on ad hocs and subcommittees?
Yes, correct. That is correct.
Okay.
Yes. And those will be detailed. And I will say that to have some of those come off in the best practice way that we can do it, we probably will be working with some different folks over the course of time up to that June timeframe. So if you get a call from us saying, hey, you know, we're going to be putting this together, what it might look like, however, please take our call and help us figure it out, because really, truly, you're the ones who can guide those to be the most on target conversations and subcommittees and ad hocs that we have. So those are for you and for the plan. Okay. All right, we have one more item here with 6 minutes left to go, and that is probably the hardest work that there is to do in any type of committee setting, and that is trying to schedule a meeting that everybody can attend and be together with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a range of proposed times in the chat box. And what we're looking for here is, we knew that we probably would not be able to survey everybody's availability in its entirety right now, but just looking at, okay, for some odd reason that did not come. Give me just a moment. There it goes. It clipped off some of it. So looking at the third and fourth week of each month, and we're looking at the June through January timeframe of having a standing GSPAC meeting that would be at the same day and time every single month. So it would be the third Thursday from 1 to 3, whatever it might be, so that we just give the community and all the stakeholders a little bit more confidence that they know when to tune in for those particular meetings. And so I know Tuesdays we want to stay away from entirely, no matter what week we're looking at. So Tuesdays are not on the table as of right now. But looking at the third or fourth week of each month in these particular time slots, if you could put in the chat window something that you know is a standing meeting that don't work at all, please let us know. And what that will help us do is to winnow down to some real specific information that we can then put out a doodle poll for folks. You just know the Board of Supervisors is a big holding place on Tuesdays, and that Tuesdays are really tough. So if you could just add your information there. Or and if for any reason that your chat function isn't working quite right, you're more than welcome to email in the facilitation team, either Maritza or I, with your availability. It's always good to give alternates to Zoom when Zoom doesn't behave quite the way you want it to. Looks like the majority of everyone has had a chance to weigh in, and we're now 3 minutes before our closing time, and we'll get everybody out the door on time. And as we depart, I want to share a little story that I think makes me definitely very happy, and I hope that it makes you happy as well. So I had cause to be part of a conversation with some folks who do a lot of work in a lot of different basins. They have worked on the 3-year cycles with basins. They have worked on very accelerated, like year and a half timelines with basins. And as we were detailing where we were at with Lake County and kind of going through what the agenda was for this second GSPAC meeting, a very veteran person commented and said, "I can't believe how far you are. This is incredible." They're like, "We've been working 6 or 8 months already, and we haven't even gotten to the first step that you all have done." And it's to the credit of all of you coming together and the